They mocked the mountain man for buying a blind virgin. Then years later they begged for mercy. A dusty street, a silent crowd. A rough-faced mountain man lays down his last $40 to save a trembling girl no one else would touch. The townsfolk laugh, calling him mad. But what they don't know is that the girl carries something more powerful than sight, something that could save or destroy them all. As storms roll over the Colorado peaks, whispers spread. The law turns crooked. The river runs dry. And the man they mocked becomes the only soul standing between a starving town and its own shame. Now, when drought and judgment hit Cold River, every cruel tongue that mocked him will kneel for mercy at his door. What secret did that blind girl carry? Why did one man's act of kindness shake an entire valley? And when justice finally rides in, who will God show mercy to, the sinner or the saved? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The July sun beat down mercilessly on Cold River's main street, baking the hard-packed earth until it cracked like a dried riverbed. John Boone guided his dun mare past the livery stable, his worn boots creaking in the stirrups. The familiar weight of his Winchester rode easy against his saddle, though his chest felt heavy with the thought of coming into town. After months alone in his line shack high in the mountains, the press of civilization made his skin itch. He needed supplies, coffee, flour, ammunition, but he'd have preferred facing a mountain lion to dealing with people. The mare's hooves kicked up little puffs of dust as she picked her way down the street. Something wasn't right. The usual afternoon bustle had gathered into a crowd outside the Dry Gulch saloon, their attention fixed on something John couldn't see. Then he heard the auctioneer's voice, sharp as a whip crack. "Do I hear $15? $15 for this fine girl's indenture papers?" John reined his horse to a stop, his weathered face darkening as he saw what had drawn the crowd. A young woman stood on a rough wooden platform, her head bowed. She wore a faded calico dress, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with tension. Behind her stood Duke Hammond, the mining foreman turned sheriff, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. John recognized him from previous visits to town. A man who wore authority like a fancy vest, all show and no substance. "Come now, gentlemen," Hammond called out, swaying slightly. "She's blind as a cave bat, but she's strong and knows her letters. Been keeping my books these past 2 years since her pa died in the mine accident." He laughed, an ugly sound. "But seems I've run into a spot of trouble at the poker table and something's got to give." John's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such things, indenture contracts sold to cover debts, but he'd never witnessed it himself. The girl's blindness was evident now in the way she stood, slightly uncertain of her footing on the platform. $10, someone shouted from the crowd. Coarse laughter followed. 12, called another voice. The girl, John heard someone call her Mercy Quinn, didn't move, but he saw her shoulders tremble slightly. Reverend Mills stood at the edge of the crowd, his black coat gathering dust. The preacher's eyes met John's for a moment, then slid away, shame written clear across his face. Still, he said nothing. John's hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, feeling the weight of his season's earnings. $40 in good American currency, meant for supplies to see him through the winter. His fingers tightened around the leather. $14. The bidding continued, accompanied by crude jokes about what use a blind girl might be. $40. John's voice cut through the laughter like a knife through butter. The crowd turned to stare at the mountain man they barely knew, this quiet figure who rarely showed his face in town. Hammond's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "What's that you say?" $40, John repeated, louder this time. In cash. Right here. He held up the leather pouch. The crowd fell silent, their earlier mirth dying away as they realized this was no joke. Even Hammond seemed to sober slightly, calculation replacing the drunken gleam in his eyes. Well now, Hammond drawled, seems we have a real gentleman among us. He looked around the crowd, but no one else spoke up. $40 going once, twice. He brought his hand down in a theatrical gesture. Sold to the mountain man. Fresh laughter rippled through the crowd, but it held a different note now. Uncertainty mixed with something like respect. John dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he approached the platform. He counted out the money carefully, placing it in Hammond's eager hands, then took the indenture papers the sheriff thrust at him. Without a word, he turned to Mercy. She stood perfectly still, her face turned slightly toward the sound of his approach. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 18. Her unseeing eyes were a pale blue, like mountain lakes in winter. Miss Quinn, he said softly, offering his arm. If you'll come with me? She hesitated for just a moment, then reached out. Her fingers found his arm with careful precision, and he helped her down from the platform. The crowd parted as they walked through, whispers following in their wake. John led her to his horse, then paused. Can you ride? Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My father taught me, before... She trailed off, but John understood. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Without another glance at the watching crowd, he turned his horse toward the edge of town. They rode in silence until the sounds of cold river faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through summer dry grass. As dusk approached, John found a sheltered spot near a stand of cottonwoods. A small creek burbled nearby, providing fresh water for both horse and riders. He helped Mercy down, noting how she oriented herself to the sounds around her. The creek, the rustle of leaves, the evening calls of birds. I'll make a fire, he said, keeping his voice gentle. You must be hungry. She nodded, settling herself on a fallen log while he gathered wood and struck his flint. Soon, a small fire crackled cheerfully, pushing back the gathering darkness. John pulled food from his saddlebags, beans, cornbread from his morning's baking, a bit of jerky. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the pop and snap of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. John watched as Mercy ate carefully, her fingers finding the edge of the tin plate he'd given her, with practiced ease. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but clear in the evening air. Why would you do this for me? John stared into the fire, considering his answer. He thought about the $40, money that would have bought him coffee and ammunition, flour and salt, maybe even a new shirt for winter. He thought about the crowd's laughter, the preacher's averted eyes, Hammond's drunken, sneering face. Because no one else would, he said simply. Mercy turned her face toward him, and though she couldn't see him, he felt the weight of her attention. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the firelight like a diamond. What happens now? She asked. John pulled the indenture papers from his coat pocket, studying them in the flickering light. According to these, you're bound to serve for another year. He paused, then continued. But I reckon papers like these don't mean much up in the mountains. You're free to go wherever you please. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if suddenly cold despite the summer evening. I have nowhere to go. My father died in the mine 2 years ago. The company said it was an accident, but... She shook her head. Hammond took me in, said he needed someone to keep his books. I can read raised letters, you see. My father made sure I learned, even after I lost my sight. John added another stick to the fire, watching the sparks rise toward the darkening sky. "There's a mission school 3 days' ride from here," he said carefully. "Run by good people. They help folks who need it, no questions asked. I could take you there if you'd like." Mercy was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the rough bark of the log. "You've already done so much," she said finally. "I couldn't ask for more." "You're not asking. I'm offering." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "John," he corrected gently. "John," she repeated, and the way she said his name made something in his chest ache, an old, familiar pain he'd thought long buried. Fire crackled between them as night settled fully over the land. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, their voices rising and falling like lonely prayers. John watched as Mercy's head began to nod, exhaustion finally catching up with her. He spread his bedroll near the fire. "You should rest," he said. "We've got a long ride ahead tomorrow." She nodded gratefully, allowing him to guide her to the blankets. He watched as she settled herself, noting how she took careful stock of her surroundings with subtle touches and tilts of her head. "I'll keep watch," he told her, though he knew she was already drifting toward sleep. Once her breathing had evened out, John leaned back against his saddle, his rifle across his knees. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and distant, while closer at hand, the fire cast dancing shadows on the cottonwood trunks. He thought about the $40, about Hammond's sneering face, about the way Mercy had stood so still and proud despite her fear. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements with others, preferring the solitude of his mountain cabin to the complications of human contact. But watching Mercy sleep peacefully by his fire, John realized some choices were made for you. Not by force or circumstance, but by the quiet voice of conscience that spoke louder than any mountain silence. The night deepened around them, and John kept his vigil, listening to the whispers of the wind and the soft breathing of the young woman whose freedom he'd purchased with a season's worth of trapping. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. Morning brought more than just sunlight to Cold River. As John led his horse down the dusty main street toward the general store, he could feel the weight of stares from every porch and window. Women gathered in small clusters, their heads bent close together, hands covering their whispers that somehow carried clear across the street. "Shameful business," one said loud enough for him to hear. "That poor girl," another replied, though her tone suggested more scandal than sympathy. John kept his eyes forward, his back straight. Beside him, Mercy walked with her hand resting lightly on his arm, her steps careful but dignified. She held her head high, though a slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her awareness of the town's scrutiny. The general store's bell jangled as they entered. Old Mr. Peterson looked up from his ledger, his usually friendly face now guarded and cool. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and fresh-cut lumber, familiar scents that suddenly felt unwelcoming. "Need supplies," John said simply. "And a good mule, if you know where I might find one." Peterson's pencil scratched against paper as he listed items. Flour, coffee, salt pork, beans. His voice was flat, professional. "Jenkins has a mule for sale. Strong animal, good for mountain trails." While Peterson gathered their supplies, the store's door opened several times. Each time, customers would step in, see John and Mercy, and either leave immediately or stand in uncomfortable silence, pretending to study shelf items while stealing glances their way. Through it all, Mercy stood quietly by the counter, her fingers occasionally brushing against the rough wood as if reading its texture. John noticed how she tilted her head slightly at each new sound. The door's bell, shuffling feet, whispered comments. The church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to morning service, The sound seemed to make Peterson even more uncomfortable. "Reverend Morton's been asking about you," he said, not quite looking at John. "Says he needs to speak with you about—" He gestured vaguely toward Mercy. "We won't be staying long enough for that," John replied, counting out money for the supplies. As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened again, and Reverend Morton himself stepped in, his black coat gathering dust from the street. The preacher's face was stern, his usual gentle manner replaced by righteous disapproval. "John Boone," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "I must speak with you about your actions yesterday. The Lord's house stands open." "Much obliged, Reverend," John cut in quietly, "but we'll be on our way soon." The preacher drew himself up. "You cannot simply— This is a matter of morality, sir. To purchase a human being, even under these irregular circumstances, and to take her, unchaperoned." He glanced at Mercy, his expression a mixture of pity and censure. "The congregation is most concerned." "Seems to me," John said, his voice level but firm, "the congregation wasn't so concerned yesterday when she was being sold like cattle." A heavy silence fell over the store. Even Peterson stopped arranging supplies on the counter. Mercy's hand tightened slightly on John's arm. Not in fear, he realized, but in support. The preacher opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of spurs jingling in the doorway. Sheriff Duke Hammond stepped into the store, his badge catching the morning light that streamed through the windows. "Well, well," Hammond drawled, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "If it ain't the mountain man and his new property." His smile was sharp as a knife. "Though I hear tell she ain't exactly new goods, if you take my meaning." John felt Mercy stiffen beside him. His own hand itched to reach for his rifle, but he kept still, knowing that's exactly what Hammond wanted. "Careful, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Those words might stick in your throat someday." Hammond's smile widened. "That a threat, Boone? Maybe you've been up in them mountains too long. Lost your senses over a blind girl." He looked around at his audience, playing to the crowd. "Though I reckon even a blind girl might look good to a man who's been alone as long as you have." John felt the rage building in his chest, but before he could respond, Mercy spoke. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a cool mountain stream. "Mr. Boone showed more Christian charity in one moment than this town has shown in 2 years, she said. "And you, Sheriff Hammond, would do well to remember that even the blind can see the truth of a man's heart." Hammond's face darkened, but something in Mercy's unseeing gaze seemed to unsettle him. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Well, ain't she just full of pretty words? Careful, Boone. Sounds like she might be more trouble than she's worth." John finished loading the supplies into his saddlebags, his movements deliberate and calm. "We'll be leaving now," he said to Peterson, ignoring Hammond completely. "Much obliged for the help." They stepped out into the street, where more townspeople had gathered, drawn by the drama unfolding in the store. John helped Mercy mount his horse, then led them toward Jenkins' place at the edge of town, where they found the mule Peterson had mentioned. The animal was indeed strong, with clear eyes and good teeth. Jenkins, a weathered old rancher who'd never had much use for town politics, treated them fairly, and even helped load the supplies onto the mule's back. "You're heading up country?" he asked as John paid him. "That's right." Jenkins nodded, glancing at the gathering clouds over the mountains. "Weather's holding fair. Should make good time if you leave soon." He paused, then added quietly, "Some folks don't understand kindness when they see it, John. Don't let it trouble you none." By mid-afternoon, they were ready to leave. The town watched from windows and doorways as John led the mule, with Mercy riding his horse, toward the mountain trail. Nobody waved goodbye. Nobody called out good wishes. Only the dust and whispers followed them. The trail wound alongside Cold River, its waters speaking in eternal whispers over rocks and through narrow channels. As the town disappeared behind them, John noticed Mercy's shoulders gradually relaxing, her head turning to catch the sounds of the wilderness. "The water," she said after they'd ridden for an hour. "It sounds different here than in town." John listened to the river's voice. "That's right. Up here it's younger, faster. In town it spreads out, runs slower." He paused, then added, "Good to learn the water's voice. It can guide you when other landmarks fail." "Will you teach me?" she asked softly. "How to listen to the wilderness?" "Already are," he replied. "Notice how the mule's bells sound? Different rhythm when we're climbing versus walking level ground. That can tell you where you are on the trail." They made camp as the sun began to sink, finding a protected spot near the river where old cottonwoods provided shelter. John helped Mercy down from the horse, noticing how she was already learning to orient herself by the sounds of water and wind. He built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon. They ate quietly, listening to the evening sounds of the mountain, country, the last calls of birds, the first voices of nocturnal creatures, the endless song of the river. "Thank you," Mercy said suddenly, "for what you said in town, about them not caring yesterday." John studied the fire. "Truth's truth. Ain't always pretty, but needs saying sometimes." "Hammond," she said, her voice catching slightly on the name. "He was there, you know, when the mine—" She trailed off, her hands twisting in her lap. "You don't have to tell me," John said gently. But Mercy continued, her words coming faster now, as if they'd been waiting too long to be spoken. "Father found something in the company books, something about Hammond cutting corners on support beams. He was going to report it, but then the explosion—" She took a shaky breath. "I was waiting outside the mine office. The blast knocked me down, filled my eyes with burning dust. When I woke up, I couldn't see, and Father was—" She fell silent. John added another stick to the fire, giving her time to collect herself. "Hammond made sure everyone blamed faulty equipment," she finished quietly. "Said he'd take care of me, make sure I had work, but really he just wanted to keep me close, keep me quiet." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the darkening sky. John thought about Hammond's smirking face, about the cruel satisfaction in his voice when he'd auctioned Mercy off. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together, forming a picture as ugly as sin. Later, after Mercy had settled into her bedroll, John sat watch by the dying fire. He listened to the night sounds, owl calls, the rustle of small animals, the constant murmur of the river. Occasionally, Mercy would stir in her sleep, mumbling words he couldn't quite catch, except for one name that came through clear as a gunshot: Hammond. John added another small branch to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. He thought about the town they'd left behind, about Hammond's threats and the preacher's condemnation. They were exiles now, but somehow that felt right. Sometimes, he reflected, you had to leave the familiar behind to find your true path. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and distant, while closer at hand, the river sang its ancient song. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in this moment of quiet beneath the mountain sky, they had found a measure of peace. The mountain trail wound higher through stands of blue spruce and aspen, following the cold river's course toward its source. For 2 days, John led their small party steadily upward, stopping often to let Mercy rest and to water the animals. He watched with quiet approval as she grew more confident, learning to interpret the changing sounds of hoofbeats on rock and soil, the different songs of the river as it narrowed and fell more steeply. On the morning of the 3rd day, John reined in his horse beside a crystalline spring that burst from beneath an ancient pine. "We're here," he said simply. Mercy tilted her head, taking in the sounds around them. The gurgle of the spring, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the cry of a jay. "Your home?" "Our home now," John replied, then quickly added, "for as long as you need it to be." He helped her down from the horse, steadying her as her feet found the packed earth of the yard. The cabin stood before them, built of solid pine logs chinked with mud and moss, its roof of hand-split shakes weathered to a soft gray. A rough stone chimney rose from one end, and a small porch wrapped around two sides. John led Mercy to the porch steps, placing her hand on the doorframe. She ran her fingers over the rough-hewn wood, feeling the axe marks that had shaped it, the weathering of years of sun and storm. Suddenly, her shoulders began to shake, and tears rolled down her cheeks. "What's wrong?" John asked, concern roughening his voice. "Nothing's wrong," Mercy whispered, still touching the doorframe as if to convince herself it was real. "It's just, I haven't felt safe, truly safe, since Father died. But this—" She took a deep breath of pine-scented air. "This feels like home." John swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. "Well then," he said gruffly, "best we get you settled in." The cabin's interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking crane swung out over the ashes of the last fire. A plank table stood under the window, two straight-backed chairs beside it. A narrow bed occupied one corner, piled with quilts against the mountain nights. Shelves held provisions, cooking implements, and a few books, including a worn Bible that had seen better days. "The bed's yours," John said, already moving blankets to make a pallet for himself near the hearth. "I'll sleep here." "But it's your bed," Mercy protested. "Was my ma's teaching that a lady gets the bed," John cut in firmly. "No arguing with that." That evening, John prepared a stew from dried elk meat, adding wild onions and the last of his stored potatoes. As he worked, Mercy sat in one of the chairs, humming softly, an old hymn that seemed to fill the cabin with memories. "That's pretty," John commented, stirring the pot. "Know the words?" "Father used to sing it," Mercy said, her voice warm with remembrance. "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want." He sang it every Sunday morning while he made breakfast. She paused, then added softly, "I haven't sung it since he died." John ladled stew into tin bowls. "Reckon he'd be glad to hear it again." They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the wind in the pines and the crackle of the fire. After the dishes were washed, John reached for the Bible on the shelf. "Would you—" Mercy hesitated. "Would you read something?" John opened the Book of Psalms, its pages soft with use. "Been reading these to myself most nights," he admitted. "Help remind me there's more to life than just surviving." He began to read, his deep voice giving weight to the ancient, words of comfort and praise. Mercy closed her eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over her like healing water. Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm as natural as the turning of the earth. John rose before dawn to tend to the animals and check his trap lines. Mercy learned the layout of the cabin, counting steps from bed to table, table to door, door to spring. She kept the fire fed, learned where everything was stored, and filled the hours with songs and prayers that made the cabin feel more like a sanctuary than a refuge. John watched her growing confidence with satisfaction, but worry gnawed at him. The cabin wasn't built for someone who couldn't see. Too many ways to stumble, to fall, to be hurt. So he set to work. First came the rails along the porch, strong poles of peeled pine set just right for a steadying hand. Mercy ran her fingers along them, smiling at the smoothness of the wood. "You didn't have to," she said. "Reckon I did," John replied, driving another nail home. "Porch ain't safe without them." Next, he rigged a clever system of bells, small ones from his trap lines, starting with the water bucket at the spring. He showed Mercy how to follow the sound, how to dip the bucket safely into the flowing water. "Listen," he instructed, demonstrating the different tones. "High note means you're too far right. Lower one means too far left. Middle tone means you're right over the deepest part." Mercy practiced until she could find the spring and fill the bucket without assistance, her face glowing with accomplishment. "It's like music," she said, laughing. "A song that leads me home." Each evening, after the day's work was done, John would read from the Psalms. Sometimes Mercy would ask questions about passages that touched her heart, and John would find himself sharing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud before. One night, as the fire burned low, Mercy asked the question that had been on her mind. "John," she said hesitantly, "I've noticed, when you move sometimes, there's a catch in your breathing, like it hurts. Are you injured?" John was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant. "Got some scars. From the war. Some you can see, some you can't." "Which war?" "The one they called civil." He stoked the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Though there wasn't nothing civil about it. Served as a scout, mostly. Saw things. He trailed off, then added quietly, "Some wars don't end when the guns stop." Mercy heard the pain in his voice, the weight of memories too heavy to share. She reached out, finding his rough hand in the firelight. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me a home, for making me feel safe." John looked down at their joined hands, feeling something shift in his heart, like ice breaking up in spring, letting life flow again. Before he could respond, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains. They both turned toward the sound. The wind had changed, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Storm clouds were building over the peaks, dark and heavy with early winter. "Storm's coming," John said, rising to check the woodpile. "Best get everything battened down." Mercy nodded, already moving to help secure the cabin for whatever weather was approaching. In just a week, she had learned to navigate this space, to make herself useful, to build a life from the broken pieces of her past. And though the storm clouds gathered and the wind rose with teeth of ice, she felt no fear. Here, in this rough cabin with this quiet man, she had found something she thought lost forever. A place where faith could flower and wounds could heal. Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, dusting the porch rails with white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and John's voice rose and fell, reading the ancient words of comfort. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight sparkling off the fresh dusting of snow. John gathered Mercy's few clothes, a worn cotton dress, 2 faded blouses, and a threadbare shawl, and carried them down to the stream for washing. The icy water bit at his hands as he worked the rough soap into the fabric, but his thoughts were elsewhere, wondering how such fine garments had fallen into such sorry state. He could picture Mercy as she must have been before, a surveyor's daughter, educated and proper. Now her clothes told the story of her years under Hammond's care. Torn seams, frayed edges, patches upon patches. John's jaw tightened. No one deserved such treatment, least of all someone like Mercy. The dress was the worst, its once pretty blue cotton now faded to gray. As John turned it in his hands, checking for tears to mend, he felt something odd, a stiffness in the lining that didn't belong. His fingers, calloused from years of trapping, detected a hidden pocket sewn into the seam. Carefully, he worked his hand into the concealed space. His fingers touched something smooth, parchment, folded small and tight. He drew it out, unfolding it with wet hands that trembled slightly in the cold mountain air. The document was official, with elaborate script across the top and a red wax seal still partially intact. John's eyes widened as he read. It was a land deed, dated 5 years prior, signed in flowing handwriting. Matthew Quinn, licensed surveyor. But it was more than just a deed. It detailed water rights to the entire Cold River Valley, carefully surveyed and legally registered. John sat back on his heels, the significance hitting him like a physical blow. This document could change everything for the valley and explain why Hammond had been so eager to keep Mercy under his thumb. The stream gurgled past as John carefully refolded the precious paper. He needed to get back to the cabin, back to Mercy. She had to know what he'd found. He finished them, washing in record time, wringing the clothes out with strong hands before carrying them, and the hidden deed back up the trail. Inside the cabin, Mercy was humming as she worked dough for biscuits, her sure fingers knowing exactly how much flour and water to add by touch alone. "Mercy," John said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Found something in your dress, something important." Her hands stilled in the dough. "What kind of something?" "A deed, signed by Matthew Quinn." He watched her face carefully. "Your father?" The color drained from Mercy's cheeks. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. That's impossible. Everything was lost in the explosion. All Father's papers, all his work." "This survived." John pulled out a chair for her. "Here, sit. Tell me about it." Mercy sank into the chair, her face troubled. "Father was hired to survey the whole valley," she began haltingly. "He worked for months, measuring every stream, every spring that fed into Cold River. He said it was important to document the water rights properly, so everyone would know their fair share." She twisted her flour-covered hands in her apron. "But then Hammond started pushing to expand the mine. Father warned him it wasn't safe. The tunnels were too close to underground springs. Hammond wouldn't listen." Her voice caught. "The night before the explosion, Father was up late, finishing his official report. He was so worried." "The blast killed him?" John asked gently. Mercy nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was helping him in his office that day. There was a flash, then darkness. When I woke up, I couldn't see anymore. Hammond said all Father's papers were destroyed in the fire that followed. He said I was lucky he took me in, gave me work to pay for my keep." John's hand clenched around the deed. "He lied. This paper survived. Maybe your father hid it, knowing it was important. It proves the water rights belong to the whole valley, not just Hammond's mining company." "No wonder he kept me so close," Mercy whispered. "He must have been afraid I knew something, remembered something." She reached out, finding John's arm. "What do we do now?" John looked at the precious document, thinking hard. "First, we keep it safe. Hammond can't know we have it, not yet." He crossed to the shelf and took down his Bible. "This here's got a hollow space in the cover. My ma used to hide emergency money in it. The deed will fit perfect." He carefully worked the folded parchment into the hidden compartment, making sure it lay flat. There, hidden in plain sight. Thunder rolled across the mountains as evening approached, bringing another storm with it. John built up the fire while Mercy finished the biscuits, neither speaking much as they prepared their simple supper. The weight of their discovery lay heavy between them. After the dishes were cleared, John knelt by his bedroll, hands clasped in prayer. The responsibility of the deed pressed on his conscience. One piece of paper that could bring justice to the valley, or bring Hammond's wrath down on them both if discovered too soon. He needed wisdom, guidance on how to proceed. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white. In the sudden brightness, John saw Mercy sitting straight in her chair, her face turned toward him as if she could see straight into his troubled heart. "Whatever it is," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "Don't let them take it. Father died trying to protect the valley's water. We can't let that sacrifice be for nothing." John rose from his knees, moved by her quiet strength. "No," he agreed solemnly. "We won't let them take it. But we need to be smart about this, Mercy. Hammond's got the law in his pocket. We'll need proof of his crimes before we can use the deed." "I remember things," Mercy said, her hands twisting in her lap. "Conversations I overheard while working in Hammond's house. Names, dates, details about the mine explosion. I couldn't see their faces, but I heard everything." Another crash of thunder shook the cabin's walls. The storm was directly overhead now, nature's fury matching the tension in the small room. John crossed to the fireplace and added another log, watching the flames leap higher. "We'll need more than memories," he said finally. "We need witnesses willing to speak up, documents, evidence that can't be denied." He glanced at the Bible on its shelf, knowing the precious cargo it contained. "And we need to stay alive long enough to find it all." Mercy nodded, understanding. "We have time," she said softly. "Winter's coming. Hammond won't expect anyone to venture up this high until spring. We can plan, gather what we need." John looked at her with growing respect. This wasn't just the frightened girl he'd rescued from the auction block anymore. This was Matthew Quinn's daughter, carrying her father's courage and sense of justice. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of energy was building. The deed hidden in the Bible wasn't just a piece of paper. It was hope for an entire valley. Hope for fair water rights, for justice long denied, for wrongs to be made right. As the thunder slowly rolled away into the distance, John and Mercy sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but it couldn't touch the quiet determination that had taken root in that small mountain cabin. The deed was safe for now, hidden away like a seed waiting for spring. When the time was right, it would bring forth its fruit of justice. Until then, they would watch and wait and prepare for the storm they knew was coming. The aspens turned golden as September wheeled into October. Morning frost painted the high meadows silver, and the afternoon sun felt thinner, carrying less warmth. But it wasn't just the season. Changing. Something was wrong with the water. John noticed it first at the spring near the cabin. The steady flow had weakened to a trickle, barely enough to fill their buckets. The smaller creeks feeding into Cold River were drying up one by one, though autumn rains should have kept them running strong. "Got to ride down to the Morrison Ranch," he told Mercy one morning, pulling on his boots. "We're nearly out of salt, and something ain't right with these creeks. Need to hear what's happening in the valley." Mercy paused in her mending, her fingers finding the edge of her chair. "Be careful. Hammond's got eyes everywhere now that he's sheriff." "I will." John checked his rifle, then hesitated. "You'll be all right here alone?" She smiled, her unseeing eyes turned toward the window. "I know every inch of this cabin now. 10 steps from the door to the table. 15 to the spring. I'll manage fine." The ride down took longer than usual. John had to lead his horse carefully around dried-up waterholes, where mud had cracked like broken pottery. The land felt wrong, thirsting too early in the season. Morrison's ranch lay in a pocket valley 5 miles below John's cabin. As he approached, he saw cattle clustered around a nearly empty stock pond. Ranch hands were digging, trying to deepen what little water remained. Old Jim Morrison met him at the barn, his weathered face grim. "Ain't natural, this drying up," he said without preamble. "Hammond's damming the river upstream of town. Says it's for his mining operation, but he's charging folks for water rights now. Those who can't pay—" He spat in the dust. John's hands tightened on his reins. "He can't do that. The river belongs to everyone." "Tell that to his new badge and his hired guns." Morrison's voice was bitter. "Half the smaller ranches are already ruined. Can't water stock, can't irrigate. Hammond's buying them out for pennies." Inside the ranch house, Morrison's wife Sarah measured out salt while the men talked. She'd added a black armband to her apron. "The Wilsons lost their place last week," she said quietly. "Their youngest took fever. No clean water for drinking." She didn't need to finish. John rode home with the salt and the heavy news, his mind churning. The deed hidden in his Bible could stop Hammond's water theft, but using it now would put Mercy in danger. Hammond would recognize her father's signature, know she must have had it all along. The cabin came into view just as the sun touched the western peaks. Mercy was standing on the porch, face turned toward the sound of his horse. Something in John's chest tightened at the sight of her waiting there. "I heard what happened at the Wilson place," she said as he dismounted. "Mrs. Morrison sent a message with you?" John nodded, then remembered she couldn't see it. "Yes. Things are bad down there, Mercy. Hammond's damming the river, charging for water that should be free. Your father's deed—" "No." Her voice was firm. "Not yet. Hammond would kill to keep that deed quiet. We need proof of his other crimes first. Witnesses willing to speak. The timing has to be right." He studied her face, seeing the same quiet strength that had kept her going through years of Hammond's cruelty. "You're right. But people are suffering." "I know." She reached out, found his arm. "Which is why I've been practicing. Learning the trails around here by heart. Counting steps, memorizing where the rocks and roots are. The more I can move around on my own, the more help I can be when the time comes." Over the next weeks, John watched as Mercy mapped her world step by careful step. She learned the sound of wind in different trees, the feel of sun on various slopes, the smell of sage versus pine. She could walk to the spring alone now, following the guide rail he'd built. Each day she ventured a little further, her confidence growing. One evening, as autumn's chill crept down from the peaks, she was exploring the path to the woodpile when her foot caught on a hidden root. John heard her startled cry and reached her in 3 long strides. "Let me see," he said, taking her hand. A scrape crossed her palm, beading with blood. "It's nothing," she protested, but let him lead her inside to the wash basin. John cleaned the scratch carefully, noting how small her hand felt in his rough one. "Need to wrap this so it don't get infected." He found a clean cloth and began binding her palm with gentle firmness. "You have healer's hands," Mercy said softly. "Steady and sure." Something passed between them then, delicate as a butterfly's wing. John finished tying off the bandage, but didn't immediately let go. Mercy's fingers curled slightly around his. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken things. Then a distant sound, horses moving through trees, made John straighten, senses suddenly alert. "Someone's coming?" Mercy asked, hearing the change in his breathing. "Maybe." He moved to the window, scanning the deepening shadows. "Stay here." John slipped out the back door and worked his way up the ridge behind the cabin. The horse sounds had stopped, but now he caught the scent of wood smoke. A campfire. probably 2 miles downstream. Easing forward through the brush, he found a spot where he could see down into the river valley. A camp had been set up near the bend. 3 or 4 men gathered around the fire. Their rifles gleamed in the firelight. One man stood apart, studying a map. Even at this distance, John recognized the way he held himself. One of Hammond's deputies, the mean one who'd laughed loudest at Mercy's auction. They were searching, moving methodically upstream, looking for… what? Illegal homesteads? Hidden witnesses? Or had Hammond somehow learned about the deed? John watched until full dark, then made his way carefully back to the cabin. Mercy was waiting by the door, her bandaged hand pressed against the rough wood. "Hammond's men," he said quietly, "making camp down by the river bend, looking for something. Or someone." Mercy's face paled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "How long until they reach us?" "At their pace. 2-3 days." John bolted the door, then checked that the Bible containing the deed was still safely hidden. "We need to be ready. Extra careful about smoke from the chimney. No moving around outside until they've passed." "And if they don't pass?" Mercy asked softly. "If they come here?" John thought of the deputies' rifles, of Hammond's growing power in the valley, of Mercy, who had already lost so much to that man's greed. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," he said. "But I won't let them hurt you again, Mercy. I swear it." She nodded, accepting his promise. Outside, a coyote wailed, a lonely sound that echoed off the ridges. The night pressed close around the cabin, full of shadows and secrets, while danger crept slowly upriver toward them. The morning frost had barely melted when John heard the soft footfalls outside his cabin door. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but something in the rhythm of those steps made him pause. Not Hammond's men. They wouldn't come so quiet. "Someone's out there," Mercy said from her chair by the fireplace, where she'd been running her fingers over the raised letters in her father's Bible. Her head tilted, listening. "Just one person. Walking careful-like." 3 gentle taps on the door confirmed her assessment. John opened it slowly, squinting against the bright autumn sunlight. A tall figure stood on the porch, wrapped in a worn wool blanket against the mountain chill. Silver-streaked hair hung in 2 long braids, and deep-set eyes studied John with ancient wisdom. "Henry White Elk," John breathed, his heart stumbling. The last time he'd seen this man was across a burning winter camp, through gun smoke and screams. But there was no hatred in the Ute elder's face, only a patient gravity that made John step back, gesturing him inside. Henry carried a bundle wrapped in fresh leaves. The rich scent of smoked trout filled the small cabin as he set it on the table. "A gift," he said, his voice soft but clear, "from the streams that still run free." Mercy stood, orienting herself toward their visitor's voice. "Welcome to our home," she said with simple dignity. "I'm Mercy Quinn." Henry's eyes softened as he took in her unseeing gaze. He touched his chest in a gesture of respect, though she couldn't see it. "Your name speaks truth, young one. There is mercy in you." John found his voice at last. "It's been many years, Henry. I never thought—" He swallowed hard. "After what happened at Bear Creek." "The past flows like water," Henry said. "It cannot be caught or held." He unwrapped the fish, the leaves crackling. "But the future, that we can shape if we choose wisdom over fear." Mercy moved carefully to the stove, feeling for the coffee pot. "Please, sit with us. Share our table." As she poured coffee into tin cups, Henry spoke of what was happening in the valley. Hammond's men were mapping every spring and seep, claiming water rights through false documents and threats. Ranchers who protested found their cattle mysteriously scattered. Even the Ute people, who had treaties guaranteeing access to ancestral water sources, were being pushed back. "The water belongs to no one man," Henry said, accepting the cup Mercy offered. "It is like the air we breathe, a gift for all living things. But Hammond sees only power and profit." John's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "How many springs has he claimed?" 12 so far. His men work their way up each tributary, posting notices. They say any who draw water without paying will face arrest." Henry's voice carried decades of seeing treaties broken, promises forgotten. "Soon they will reach the high country where the waters begin." Mercy sat very still, her face troubled. "The spring that feeds this cabin, will they claim that too?" "They will try." Henry set his cup down with deliberate care. "But I did not come only to bring warning. I came because I remembered a man who once wore a blue uniform and carried a heavy heart." John felt the old shame rise up like bile. "I was an army scout. They told us that camp was abandoned, just checking for raiders. But there were families there sleeping. The fire spread so fast." His voice cracked. "I see their faces in my dreams still." "I know." Henry's eyes held no condemnation. "I was there that night. I saw you try to save the children when the flames took hold. I saw you weep after." Mercy reached across the table, found John's hand. Her touch anchored him as the memories threatened to overwhelm. "You carry shame heavier than snow," Henry continued gently. "Let it melt. The past cannot be undone, but the future waits like unwritten tracks in fresh powder. Today we face a common enemy, one who would steal the very water of life from all people." John drew a shaking breath. "Why forgive me, after what I was part of?" "Because hatred is a poison that kills the one who carries it." Henry gestured to the window, where aspen leaves danced gold in the sunlight. "See how the trees share the same soil, drink from the same springs? They do not ask if their neighbor's roots are white man's or Indians. They grow strong together, or they die alone." Tears ran down Mercy's cheeks as she listened. Her hand tightened on John's. "Like the living water Jesus spoke of," she whispered, "flowing for all who thirst." "Just so." Henry nodded. "The Creator's gifts cannot be bought or sold. They must flow free, or all suffer." He turned to John. "Will you help us protect the waters? Not just for your people or mine, but for all who live in these hills?" John thought of Morrison's failing ranch, of the Wilson child lost to fever, of Hammond's greed poisoning the valley like alkali in a water hole. He met Henry's steady gaze. "I will," he said, "whatever it takes." "Then we begin with truth." Henry reached into his blanket and drew out a folded paper, a map marked with spring locations and Ute names. Knowledge of the water paths, passed down through generations. Hammond's men do not know these places yet. They spent the next hour bent over the map, John marking locations while Henry shared the stories behind each name. Mercy listened intently, her fingers tracing the cabin's table grain as the men talked of watersheds and hidden seeps. As the afternoon light began to fade, Henry rose to leave. "Winter comes early to the high country," he said, wrapping his blanket closer. "Already the night air carries frost." John walked him to the door. Outside, the first hints of winter decorated the porch rails with delicate ice crystals. A thin white dust coated the ground where shadows lay deepest. "The valley's people will need to stand together," Henry said quietly. "Both those who came before and those who came after. The water must flow free for any of us to survive." "I understand now," John replied. "Thank you for the warning and for the gift of forgiveness I never thought to receive." Henry touched his shoulder briefly. "You have been given a second chance, my friend. Use it well." He glanced back at Mercy, who stood in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "Take care of each other. Dark days come before the spring thaw." They watched him disappear into the lengthening shadows, his footsteps as silent as his arrival had been. The frost deepened as evening fell, sealing the day's alliance in crystalline patterns across the sleeping land. Inside the cabin, Mercy built up the fire while John stored the precious smoked trout. Neither spoke for a long while, each lost in thought. Finally, Mercy broke the silence. "I felt it," she said softly. "When he forgave you, it was like a weight lifting from this room, like finally being able to breathe deep after holding your breath too long." John came to stand beside her at the fireplace. "I never thought to find peace for what happened at that camp. Figured I'd carry that burden to my grave. But now. He watched the flames dance. "Now I see that maybe the best way to honor those lives is to protect others. To stand against men like Hammond who'd steal the very water from children's mouths." Mercy nodded. "Henry was right about the water belonging to everyone. Like my father always said, you can't own a river any more than you can own the wind." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney into the deepening night. Outside, frost continued its slow march across the land, binding settler and Ute territories alike in its silvery embrace. A new alliance had been forged this day, as delicate as the ice crystals on the porch rail, but carrying seeds of hope for the troubled valley below. The early winter wind whistled through pine boughs, carrying the first real snow of the season. Inside the cabin, Mercy sat cross-legged by the hearth, her nimble fingers sorting through bundles of dried herbs. Jonturat watched from his chair as she separated them with careful precision, identifying each by touch and scent. "This one's yarrow," she said confidently, setting it in a neat pile to her left. "And here's sage. The leaves feel like soft velvet." She held another sprig to her nose. Mint for tea." John smiled, though she couldn't see it. "You've got a better nose for herbs than most folks with 2 good eyes. Father taught me about plants before." She paused, then continued softly. "Well, before. He said knowing medicines was important in the high country, where doctors are scarce." The fire popped and crackled as she worked, her movements growing more certain with each bundle. John marveled at how quickly she'd adapted to life in the cabin. In just a few short weeks, she'd learned to navigate the small space without hesitation, counting steps between the stove and table, door and bed. "Think I'll check on that ornery mule," John said, rising. "Storm's coming. I can feel it in my bones." "I'll do it," Mercy offered, carefully setting aside her herbs. "I've been learning his ways. He likes when I scratch behind his ears and talk to him." John started to protest, but held his tongue. She needed her independence, he reminded himself. Instead, he helped her into her heavy shawl and watched from the doorway as she made her way to the barn, one hand trailing along the guide rope he'd strung between buildings. Her voice drifted back through the cold air. "There's my good boy. Are you hungry, old fellow?" The mule's soft nickering answered her. While she tended to the animal, John gathered more firewood. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, promising heavy snow. They'd need extra warmth for the days ahead. Inside again, they settled into their evening routine. John lit the lamp while Mercy stoked the fire. The familiar scents of coffee and wood smoke filled the cabin as shadows lengthened across the plank floor. "Would you read to me?" Mercy asked, taking her usual place in the rocking chair. "From the Book of Psalms?" John retrieved the Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. As he read about still waters and green pastures, Mercy's face took on that peaceful expression he'd come to treasure. Her hands moved steadily, working on mending a pair of wool socks. Later, He brought out her father's old survey notes, recovered from Hammond's office during their escape. The pages crackled as he turned them carefully. "Here's one from spring of '73, he said. "Your father wrote about finding a new spring near Elk Ridge. Says the water there runs sweet and clear, even in drought years." Mercy's fingers stilled on her mending. "I remember that day. He let me taste the water, said it was pure as heaven's tears." She smiled at the memory. He loved these mountains so much, mapping every stream and spring. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. John added another log to the fire as Mercy hummed softly, an old hymn about grace and shelter. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket, making his heart ache with a sweetness he hardly dared name. The blizzard struck just before midnight, howling down from the high peaks like a wild thing. For 3 days, they stayed close to the cabin's warmth while snow piled deep against the walls. John kept the fire well fed, and Mercy brewed endless cups of mint tea. To pass the time, John took up his carving knife and a piece of seasoned aspen wood. As Mercy sat nearby stringing dried berries for winter storage, he worked slowly and methodically, letting the wood's natural grain guide his blade. "What are you making?" she asked, hearing the steady scrape of steel on wood. "You'll see," he answered, then caught himself. "I mean, you'll know soon enough." The walking stick took shape under his careful hands, smooth and straight, with a comfortable grip sized just right for Mercy's small fingers. Near the top, he carved a simple pattern of flowing lines that reminded him of water rippling over stones. When it was finished, he rubbed it with beeswax until the wood glowed golden in the lamplight. Then he placed it in her hands, letting her explore it through touch. "Oh," she breathed, fingers tracing the carved design. "It's beautiful. I can feel the care you put into every detail." She stood, testing its height. "Perfect," she declared, tapping it gently on the floor. "Now I can walk the trails more easily come spring." John's chest tightened at her radiant smile. "Just want you to be safe," he managed gruffly. That evening, as he checked the wood supply, Mercy called him to her side. "I have something for you too," she said shyly. From her pocket, she withdrew a heavy silver watch on a chain. "It was Father's. I've kept it close all these years, but—" She held it out. "I'd like you to have it." John stared at the gleaming timepiece. "Mercy, I couldn't. It's too precious." "Please," she insisted softly. "You keep time for both of us now, and I know you'll treasure it like he did." Their fingers brushed as he accepted the gift. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking moments he wished could last forever. Wolves sang that night, their voices carrying across the frozen creek. The sound was lonely, yet beautiful, like the wild heart of winter itself. John sat by the dying fire, watching Mercy sleep peacefully in her curtained alcove. The watch pressed against his chest where he'd tucked it in his shirt pocket, its gentle rhythm matching his heartbeat. In that quiet hour, with snow falling soft as whispered prayers outside, John finally admitted to himself what he'd known for weeks. He loved her quiet strength and unfailing kindness, loved how she faced each day's challenges with grace and determination, loved the way her presence had transformed his solitary cabin into a true home. But fear held his tongue. What could he offer her, really? A hard life in the high country, with danger pressing in from all sides. And how could he be sure her gratitude for rescue hadn't become confused with deeper feelings? So he kept his love unspoken, though it filled his heart near to bursting. Instead, he wrapped it in small acts of devotion. The carved walking stick, the guide ropes between buildings, the hours spent reading aloud while she worked. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. They passed the time with quiet tasks, John repairing harness leather while Mercy braided corn husks into doormats. She taught him the words to her favorite hymns, and he shared stories of his trapping days, making her laugh with tales of outsmarting clever foxes. Through it all, the pocket watch marked the hours of their shared life, its silver case warming against John's heart. Like the aspen walking stick learning the shape of Mercy's hand, some things needed no words to speak their truth. When the storm finally passed, they opened the cabin door to find the world transformed. Snow lay deep and unmarked, glittering in the pale winter sun. The creek had frozen solid, locked beneath ice that sang with strange music when the wind blew. Mercy stood in the doorway, her face tilted up to feel the weak sunlight. "Everything sounds different," she observed, "muffled and far away, like the snow has wrapped the whole mountain in wool." "Looks that way too," John replied. "Not a track in sight, except where the deer passed under the big pine." He helped her down the cleared path to the barn, steadying her when she slipped on hidden ice. The mule greeted them with a soft whicker, grateful for fresh hay and the warmth of their attention. As Mercy checked his water bucket, humming contentedly, John watched her sure movements with pride and that ever-present ache of unspoken love. Let it be enough, he thought, to share these quiet days, to keep her safe and see her smile, to walk beside her through whatever storms might come. Outside, winter settled deep around the little cabin. But within its walls, 2 hearts beat stronger together than apart, even if one's love remained silent as new-fallen snow. March brought the great thaw to the mountains. The cold river swelled with snowmelt, its waters rushing dark and powerful between banks still lined with dying ice. Each morning, the sound grew louder as winter's grip loosened its hold on the high country. John stood on his cabin porch, coffee cup steaming in the crisp dawn air, listening to the creek's rising voice. The winter had passed peacefully enough, but spring always brought change and trouble. He could feel it coming like the damp wind that carried the scent of mud and new grass. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Mercy stepped out carefully, one hand trailing along the guide rope he'd strung between the porch posts. She'd grown more confident in her movements over the months, learning every board and corner of their small domain. "The creek sounds angry today," she observed, turning her face toward the rushing water. "Running high with snowmelt," John replied. "Ground's still frozen up high, so all that water's got nowhere to go but down." They shared a quiet moment, listening to the water's voice. Then the distant sound of hoofbeats made John straighten. Only one person regularly rode the high trail this early in spring. Henry White. Elk appeared through the morning mist like a spirit, his old paint horse picking its way carefully along the muddy path. The Ute elder carried his years with dignity, his silver hair bound back with a leather tie, his weathered face creased with both wisdom and worry. "Brother," he called softly, dismounting with practiced ease. "Sister, I bring news from the valley." John helped him lead the horse to shelter, while Mercy hurried inside to prepare coffee and cornbread. Soon they sat around the rough-hewn table, steam rising from their cups, as Henry shared his tidings. "The dam Hammond built." Henry's voice carried the weight of troubled waters. "A sluice gate burst 3 days ago. The backup flooded several ranch wells before anyone could stop it. Now those wells run with mud and rust." He sipped his coffee slowly. "People are scared. Angry. Even the sheriff's friends whisper against him now." John's hand tightened on his cup. "How bad?" "The Larson place lost their good well. Roberts, too. Their stock must drink from the creek now. but Hammond claims that water belongs to his mining rights. Henry's dark eyes met John's. Some talk of taking matters into their own hands. Mercy sat very still, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. And the Ute families? Do they still have clean water? Henry's expression softened at her concern. We are blessed with high springs, but what happens upstream always flows down to all in time. They spoke through the morning, Henry sharing more details of the valley's troubles. When he finally rode out, John stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the trees. The weight of decision pressed heavy on his shoulders. "We have to go down," he said at last, turning to Mercy. "I need to trade for seed anyway, and best we know what's brewing in town." Mercy nodded slowly. "I'm coming with you, at least part way." "Mercy!" "Please, John. I've been cooped up all winter. I need to feel the sun on my face and smell spring coming." She smiled slightly. "Besides, you might need my ears. I hear things others miss." He couldn't argue with that truth. Over the winter, he'd learned to trust her acute hearing and keen intuition. "We'll ride double as far as Shepherd's Ravine," he conceded. "There's good camping there, and you'll be safe while I go on to town." They spent the afternoon preparing. John checked his rifle and packed trading goods, dried meat, furs, and medicinal herbs Mercy had prepared. She gathered her own supplies, including the walking stick he'd carved her. Her sure movements around the cabin made his heart ache with pride, and that deeper feeling he still couldn't voice. They set, out at first light the next morning. Mercy sat securely in front of John on his sturdy mountain horse, while the pack mule followed behind. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, their bare branches just beginning to show the faint green haze of coming leaves. Mercy tilted her face to catch the warm spring sun, smiling as chickadees called from the trees. "Everything smells alive," she observed, "like the whole mountain is waking up." John guided the horse carefully around mud patches and over exposed roots. Having her so close, trusting him completely as they descended the familiar trail, filled him with a fierce protectiveness. He'd done his best to give her a safe haven through the winter. Now spring was forcing them both back into the world's troubles. They made good time, reaching Shepherd's Ravine by late afternoon. The sheltered hollow offered good grazing and a clean spring with steep walls that blocked the worst winds. John helped Mercy down, steadying her until she got her bearings. 10 steps to the spring," he reminded her. "Watch for loose rocks near the edge. I've cleared a path, but still be careful." She squeezed his arm. "I'll be fine, John. I know how to listen for the ravine's edge." They set up camp efficiently, practiced from their months together. Soon a small fire burned cheerfully, heating coffee and beans. The evening air grew cool as shadows lengthened across their hollow. After supper, they sat quiet by the fire. Stars began appearing overhead, bright and clear in the mountain sky. John found himself struggling with the weight of what lay ahead. The deed hidden in his Bible could bring justice to the valley, or spark violence if revealed wrongly. The responsibility pressed down like a physical burden. Finally, he did something he rarely allowed himself. He prayed aloud. "Lord," he said softly, his rough voice carrying in the still air. "I ain't much for asking favors, but I need guidance now." He paused, searching for words. "Should I choose truth or peace? Which serves you better in this case?" The fire crackled. An owl called from somewhere up the ravine. Then Mercy's clear voice answered in the darkness. "Truth is peace." John turned to her, surprised. She sat with her face lifted to the stars she couldn't see, peaceful and certain. "Truth is the only real peace," she continued softly. "Lies bring only false quiet that rots the heart. My father taught me that." Her hands folded in her lap. "We've hidden long enough, John. It's time to let truth do its work." The simplicity of her wisdom struck him silent. She was right, of course. Real peace couldn't come from hiding what was right. It had to be built on truth's foundation, whatever the cost. "You sound just like your father," he said finally. She smiled, a hint of tears in her unseeing eyes. "He would have liked you, John. You're both men who choose what's right over what's easy." The night deepened around them. John added wood to the fire, watching sparks rise toward the stars. Tomorrow he would ride into Cold River alone, carrying a hidden deed and the weight of coming change. But tonight, in this peaceful hollow with Mercy's quiet strength beside him, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. She began humming softly, one of the hymns she'd taught him over the winter. Soon her clear voice lifted in words that seemed to speak directly to their situation. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." The ancient words floated up with the sparks, carrying their truth to the listening stars. John bowed his head, letting the music wash over him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Mountain man and blind girl, bound by honor and growing love, choosing truth's harder path toward real peace. As Mercy's song faded into the night sounds of the awakening spring, John felt the rightness of their decision settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring what it would. Tonight was for gathering strength from shared purpose and the quiet courage of choosing truth over fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold River's main street as John Boone rode in, his horse's hooves kicking up dust from the dry ground. He'd left Mercy safe at the Anderson homestead 2 miles out of town, where Sarah Anderson had welcomed her like a long-lost daughter. The kind-hearted rancher's wife had lost her own girl to fever years back, and her gentle manner with Mercy had eased John's worry about leaving her. Now, tying his horse outside the mercantile, John noticed the changes in Cold River. The once bustling mining town had grown desperate. Dirty-faced children carried water buckets from the single working well in the town square. Women waited in a long line, their faces drawn with worry. The sound of angry voices drifted from the saloon, despite the early hour. "Ain't seen you in months, Boone," old Pete called from his usual spot on the mercantile porch. The ancient store clerk squinted at him through rheumy eyes. "Town's gone mean since you left." John nodded, keeping his voice neutral. "So I hear. Need supplies." Inside the store, he gathered what he needed: seeds for spring planting, coffee, ammunition, and other necessities. As he counted out coins on the counter, raised voices from outside drew his attention. "10 cents a barrel, take it or leave it." The sharp voice belonged to one of Hammond's deputies, standing by a wagon loaded with water barrels. A rancher, John recognized him as Jim Larson, faced the deputy with clenched fists. "That water belongs to everyone," Larson shouted. "Our wells are fouled because of Hammond's dam breaking. You can't charge us for what's rightfully ours." The deputy's hand dropped to his gun. "Sheriff Hammond says different. Pay up or go thirsty." John watched through the dusty window as Larson finally dug into his pocket, hands shaking with rage as he counted out coins. Other townspeople looked on, their faces dark with suppressed anger. "It ain't right," old Pete muttered, wrapping John's purchases. "Hammond's got the whole valley by the throat, claims he's got deeds to all the water rights, but funny thing is, nobody ever saw those deeds till after the mine closed." John's hand instinctively touched the Bible in his saddlebag, where Mercy's father's true deed lay hidden. "That's so. Mighty convenient, them deeds appearing just when Hammond needed 'em." Old Pete leaned closer, lowering his voice. Tommy Jenkins. He used to clerk at the land office. Told me Hammond brought him a stack of papers to notarize last year. Poor Tommy was 3 sheets to the wind most days. Might have put his seal on anything. Where's Tommy now? Dead. Pete spat into a bucket. Fell down the mine shaft last winter. At least that's the official story. John gathered his supplies, mind working. He'd suspected Hammond's claims were false, but now he had confirmation. The question was how to expose the truth without putting Mercy in danger. Throughout the day, he moved carefully through town, listening more than talking. The saloon buzzed with angry whispers. Ranchers spoke of organizing against Hammond. Store owners complained of losing business as families spent their money on water instead of goods. Even the preacher looked troubled, watching Hammond's men collect their water taxes. Near sunset, John saw Hammond himself stride from the sheriff's office toward the saloon. The man walked like he owned the town, badge gleaming on his chest, fancy boots raising dust. 2 deputies flanked him like guard dogs. "Evening, Boone," Hammond called, his voice falsely friendly. "Heard you've been playing house up in the hills with our blind girl. Getting lonely out there?" John met his gaze steadily, but said nothing. Hammond's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You know, some folks might wonder what a man like you wants with a helpless blind girl," Hammond continued. "Maybe I should look into that, being sheriff and all." "Maybe you should look into them water deeds instead," John replied quietly. "Seeing as how they came about so strange." Hammond's smile vanished. "You want to be careful what you say about legal matters, Boone. Man could get hurt, spreading lies about official documents." "Truth ain't lies, Duke." John turned away, but not before seeing the flash of fear in Hammond's eyes. The man had something to hide, all right. After dark, John made his way to the stage office. The evening stage was preparing to leave for Denver, where the Territorial Land Office kept records of all legal deeds. He'd spent the afternoon carefully writing a letter requesting verification of water rights in the Cold River Valley. He included a description of Mercy's father's deed, but didn't mention its existence. Better to let the land office discover the truth themselves. The stage driver, an old acquaintance named Mac, took the letter with a knowing look. "Might be a week or more before you get an answer," he warned. "I can wait," John replied. "Just make sure it gets there safe." "You know me, Boone. Regular as clockwork." John waited until the stage disappeared into the darkness before heading back to where he'd tied his horse. The street was empty now, most folks home behind locked doors. Only lamplight from the saloon spilled onto the dusty street. The attack came without warning. 3 shadows detached themselves from the darkness beside the mercantile. John caught a glimpse of deputy badges in the dim light before the first punch landed. He rolled with the blow, coming up fighting. These weren't drunken brawlers. Hammond had chosen men who knew their business. They worked together, trying to pin John against the wall. A knife glinted. John kicked out, catching one man in the knee. A satisfying crack was followed by a howl of pain. The other 2 pressed their advantage. John took a hard hit to the ribs, but managed to drive his elbow into a throat. The 3rd man wrapped an arm around his neck from behind. John grabbed the arm and heaved forward, using his attacker's weight to flip him over his shoulder. The man crashed into a stack of empty barrels. "Hammond sends his regards," one deputy gasped, scrambling away. "Next time won't be so friendly." John didn't waste breath responding. He ran for his horse, hearing shouts behind him as more of Hammond's men emerged from the saloon. His mount danced nervously as he swung into the saddle. Gunshots cracked in the night air. John felt the wind of a bullet pass his cheek as he spurred his horse down the street. More shots followed as he galloped out of town. Bullets thudded into pine branches along the trail. John rode low over his horse's neck, blessing the darkness that made him a poor target. He didn't slow until he was well away from town, his horses breathing heavy in the quiet night. Pain throbbed in his ribs where he'd been hit, but nothing seemed broken. Hammond's message was clear. He knew someone was questioning his authority, and he meant to stop it. John touched his Bible again, feeling the deed hidden within. The truth it contained could free the valley from Hammond's grip, but it would take careful handling. One wrong move could bring disaster down on them all. He rode on through the darkness, grateful that Mercy waited safely at the Anderson place. Sarah would keep her comfortable until he returned. Meanwhile, his letter was on its way to Denver. Once the land office confirmed the forgery, Hammond's power would crumble. If they lived that long. Dawn was breaking as John finally approached the Anderson homestead. His horse was tired, and his ribs ached fiercely, but his mind was clear. The coming fight wouldn't be settled with fists or guns. It would take patience, wisdom, and faith in the power of truth to overcome Hammond's lies. As he dismounted in the Andersons' yard, he heard Mercy's voice from the porch. She was singing hymns with Sarah as they worked, her clear tones carrying on the morning air. The sound steadied him, reminding him what they were fighting for. Not just water rights, but the chance for good people to live in peace and dignity. Looking back toward town, John saw dust rising from the distant street. Hammond wouldn't wait long to make his next move. But for now, Mercy was safe. The letter was on its way, and truth was finally stirring in the valley. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Sarah Anderson's homestead glowed like a beacon in the gathering dusk. Lamplight spilled from the windows, and the smell of fresh bread drifted on the evening air. Mercy sat in a rocking chair on the covered porch, her fingers working steadily at mending a torn quilt. Though her eyes saw nothing, her other senses remained sharp as ever. The crunch of approaching hoofbeats made her lift her head. "John," she called softly into the darkness. Something in the rhythm of the horse's gait seemed wrong. Too careful, too measured. Her heart quickened. The horse stopped in the yard. She heard the heavy sound of boots hitting dirt, followed by a muffled grunt of pain. Mercy set aside her mending and stood, gripping the porch rail. "John Boone, what's happened to you?" "Nothing worth fussing over," he answered, but his voice was tight with strain. She heard him stumble slightly on the porch steps. Sarah Anderson came to the screen door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Land sakes, Mr. Boone, you're bleeding!" Mercy's hands flew to her mouth. "Where? How bad?" "Just caught a bullet across the arm," John said. "Mostly a scratch. Hammond's men were feeling unfriendly." Sarah clucked her tongue. "Robert," she called to her husband, "fetch my medicine box from the kitchen shelf and bring clean water and bandages." Mercy found her way to John's side, her practiced steps sure in the familiar space. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, feeling the wet tackiness of blood. "Here, sit," she commanded, guiding him to a straight-backed chair. "Let me help." "You can't even see what you're doing," John protested weakly. "My fingers see well enough," Mercy replied. She had learned the healing arts from necessity during her years of servitude, treating the wounds of other workers in Hammond's household. "Sarah will be my eyes where I need them." The older woman brought supplies, and Robert built up the fire in the stone hearth. By its warmth, Mercy and Sarah worked together to clean and dress John's wound. His sleeve had to be cut away, revealing a deep graze across his upper arm where the bullet had torn through flesh. "The bleeding's mostly stopped," Sarah reported, "but it'll need stitching." Mercy's fingers probed gently around the wound. "I can do it. I've stitched plenty of wounds before, and my needlework is straight." She kept her voice steady, though her heart ached at the thought of John being hurt. John sat quietly as Mercy worked, her sure, fingers placing neat stitches by touch, alone. Sarah held a lamp close, confirming that each stitch was true. Only the occasional tightening of his muscles betrayed John's discomfort. When the wound was bound in clean linen, Sarah and Robert withdrew to the kitchen, leaving John and Mercy alone by the fire. Mercy's hands trembled as she wiped them clean on a damp cloth. "Tell me true," she whispered. "How close did they come to killing you?" John's calloused hand found hers. "Close enough to make a man think hard about his choices." "And what thoughts did you have?" "That I've got too much left undone to die just yet." He squeezed her fingers. "That I couldn't bear leaving you alone." Mercy's throat tightened. "Then don't," she said softly. "Make me your wife before God, so if anything happens, I'll have that much of you to hold on to." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Mercy held her breath, afraid she'd spoken too boldly. Finally, John cleared his throat. "You deserve better than a secret ceremony in a borrowed parlor." "I deserve the man I love, who risked everything to save me." Mercy's voice gained strength. "I don't need a fancy wedding, just your word before God and someone to witness." John's thumb traced circles on her palm. "You're sure about this, about me?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Mercy smiled. "Sarah's a proper witness. She was a school teacher before she married Robert, and we have your Bible." John stood, still holding her hand. "Mrs. Anderson?" he called. "Might we ask a favor?" Sarah and Robert returned to the parlor. When John explained their wish, Sarah clasped her hands in delight. "Of course we'll witness. Robert, fetch the good glasses. We'll use the blackberry wine for communion, and I've fresh bread from this afternoon." While Robert went for the wine, Sarah bustled about, clearing space in the parlor. She set out her best tablecloth and arranged the bread and wine with careful dignity. John retrieved his Bible from his saddlebag, the one that held Mercy's father's deed hidden within its cover. They gathered in a small circle, the fire casting warm light over them all. Sarah had insisted on pinning a sprig of dried lavender from her kitchen herbs to Mercy's collar. "Every bride should wear flowers," she declared. John took Mercy's hands in his. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke the ancient words. "I, John, take thee, Mercy, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth." Mercy's clear voice never wavered as she repeated the vows. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Robert handed them each a tin cup of wine, and John read from 1 Corinthians about love being patient and kind. As they shared the bread and wine in communion, the first soft patter of rain sounded on the roof. Sarah gasped in delight. "A rain blessing on your wedding day!" The gentle shower continued as they finished the simple ceremony. When John kissed his bride, thunder rumbled in the distance, not threatening, but like a benediction. "The rain won't last," Robert said, looking out the window. "But maybe it's a sign of better days coming?" Sarah insisted on making up the spare room for them, though John protested they should ride on. "Nonsense," she declared. "No bride should spend her wedding night in the saddle. You'll stay here where it's safe and dry." Later, as they lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rain, Mercy curled against John's uninjured side. "I don't feel afraid anymore," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of anything. Whatever comes, we'll face it together now." John kissed her forehead. "Together," he agreed. His arm tightened around her, and for the first time in weeks, they both slept deeply and peacefully, lulled by the gentle rain and the comfort of belonging to each other at last. Outside, the shower passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the night air fresh and clean. The moon broke through parting clouds, silvering the wet grass and the distant mountains. In the Andersons' parlor, John's Bible lay open on the table, witness to the sacred promises made before its pages. Inside, Mercy's father's deed waited for its moment to bring truth to light. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, love and faith had made their own truth in the hearts of two people who had found each other against all odds. Through the cabin's small window, John watched the dust cloud approaching along the winding trail. His arm still ached from the bullet wound, but his fingers found the rifle anyway. Behind him, Mercy hummed softly as she kneaded bread dough, her hands moving with practiced confidence. "Rider's coming," he said quietly. "At least 5. Mercy's hands stilled. "Hammond?" "Looks like." John's jaw tightened. "And his deputies." Sarah Anderson hurried in from the garden, wiping dirt from her hands. "Robert's gone to town for supplies. Should I send one of the hands for help?" Before John could answer, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. The front door crashed open, boots stomping across the wooden floor. Sheriff Duke Hammond filled the doorway, his badge gleaming as bright as his cruel smile. "Well, well," Hammond drawled. "Quite the cozy scene? Playing house with your purchased woman, Boone?" John's rifle stayed steady. "Get out!" Hammond held up a paper. "Can't do that. Got me a warrant here. Says you're wanted for theft and unlawful possession of state water records." His deputies spread out, hands on their guns. "Though I admit, letting the blind girl do your stealing was clever." "That's a lie," Mercy said firmly. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. "My father's deed is legal and true." "Your father?" Hammond's laugh was sharp. "Your father was a drunk who died in my mine. Whatever paper you think you have is worthless." "The land office will prove different," John said. "Once they verify the deed." "You mean this deed?" Hammond reached into his coat and pulled out a familiar folded parchment. John's heart sank. They must have searched the cabin while he and Mercy were at the Andersons. "Found it in your Bible, Boone. That's practically sacrilege, hiding stolen property in Scripture." 2 deputies moved toward Mercy. Sarah tried to step between them, but another deputy pulled her back. "Don't touch her," John warned, but Hammond's gun was already aimed at his chest. "Drop the rifle, Boone," Hammond ordered. "Unless you want to explain to the Lord why you got Mrs. Anderson killed." John's hands shook with rage as he set the rifle down. The deputies grabbed Mercy roughly, making her stumble. "John?" Her voice trembled as they pulled her towards the door. "It's all right, Mercy," he said, though his heart was breaking. "I'll come for you, I swear it." Hammond smirked. "Sweet promises, but she'll be safely locked up in Cold River Jail until the circuit judge arrives. Can't have her spreading more lies about legal documents." He waved the deed. "This here's evidence of your crimes." "The only criminal here is you," Sarah spat. "Watch your tongue, Mrs. Anderson," Hammond warned. "Wouldn't want folks thinking you and your husband were accomplices." They dragged Mercy outside. John started forward, but Hammond's gun pressed against his chest. "Not so fast. You're staying here until we're well away. Try to follow, and the girl will suffer for it." John could only watch helplessly as they lifted Mercy onto a horse, binding her hands to the saddle horn. Her face was pale but composed, her unseeing eyes lifted to the sky as if seeking strength from above. Hammond mounted his horse, tucking the deed into his vest. "I always knew you'd cause trouble, Boone. Should have left her where she belonged, serving her betters in my household." The dust had barely settled when Sarah grabbed John's arm. "Robert will be back soon. We'll help you get her out." John shook his head. "They'll be watching for me, but I know someone who can help." He grabbed his coat, checking that his pistol was still hidden in the lining. "Send Robert to Henry White Elk's camp when he returns. Tell him what happened." "The Ute elder," Sarah frowned. "What can he do?" "He trades in Cold River regular. His wagon won't draw attention." John's mind raced ahead, planning. "And he knows the truth about Hammond." Sarah pressed some bread and dried meat into his hands. "Be careful. That snake Hammond will shoot you on sight." "The Lord watches over fools and lovers," John said grimly. "And I'm both." He rode hard through the afternoon, taking hidden trails to Henry's camp. The old man listened gravely to John's story, then nodded once. "The water belongs to all people. This Falseheart sheriff must be stopped." They waited for darkness, then hitched Henry's horses to his trade wagon. John hid beneath blankets and furs in the back, while Henry drove slowly toward Cold River. The night was moonless, perfect for their purpose. As they traveled, John's thoughts were full of Mercy. He pictured her alone in a cell, surrounded by darkness, both physical and spiritual. But he knew her strength. She had survived years of Hammond's cruelty before. She would endure. The wagon creaked into town just before dawn. Henry pulled up near the livery stable, speaking quietly in Ute to his horses. Through a gap in the blankets, John could see lamplight in the jail windows. Whispers reached his ears as early risers gathered in the street. "Did you hear? The blind girl was working with Boone to steal water rights. Always knew there was something wrong about her, acting so pure and helpless. Hammond says she forged her own father's signature on fake deeds." John's hands clenched into fists. How quickly they turned on her, these townspeople who had watched her suffer for years. But he forced himself to lie still as Henry unhitched the horses and led them to water. A deputy passed close to the wagon. "Morning, White Elk. Brought more furs to trade?" "Many furs," Henry answered calmly. "Good price today, maybe." The deputy laughed. "Better hurry. Town's going to be busy once the circuit judge arrives. Big trial coming. That blind girl and her mountain man friend tried to cheat good folks out of their water rights." "Water belongs to all," Henry said mildly. "Not in Cold River it don't. Sheriff Hammond owns those rights fair and square." The deputy spat in the dust. "Though I reckon that blind girl won't see the inside of a prison. Hammond might show mercy. Let her work off her crimes in his household instead." John bit back a growl. He knew what kind of mercy Hammond would show. The man's cruelty was matched only by his greed. Finally, the deputy moved on. Henry came to the back of the wagon, pretending to check his trade goods. "They keep 2 guards," he murmured. "One walks the street, one stays inside. The girl is in the back cell." John's fingers found his pistol. "Get clear of town after sunset. I'll handle the rest." "The Creator guides your path, brother," Henry said softly. "But remember, blood calls for blood. Choose wisdom over vengeance." The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. John lay motionless under the firs as Henry conducted his trading business, listening to the town's rumors grow wilder with each telling. By noon, the story claimed Mercy had been planning to poison the town's water. By mid-afternoon, she was accused of being in league with outlaws to steal the whole valley. Through it all, Hammond's satisfied voice could be heard holding court from the sheriff's office, playing the role of protector of law and order. He had built his power on such lies, John realized. The whole town was caught in his web of corruption. But there were a few quiet voices of doubt. The rancher's wife, who remembered Mercy's gentle ways with children. The old miner who spoke of her father's honest reputation. Seeds of truth that might yet grow, if given the chance. As the sun finally set, Henry made a show of preparing to leave town. But he left the wagon where it was, telling the livery boy he would return in the morning. Then he rode out, leading his horses toward his camp. John waited until full dark. The street grew quiet as the saloon's raucous noise drew most folks indoors. He slipped from beneath the firs and moved like a shadow through the darkness, years of mountain hunting serving him well. The jail's back window was barred but unlatched. Through it, he could hear Mercy's clear voice reciting psalms of deliverance. His heart ached at her courage. Soon, he promised silently. Soon this would end, one way or another. Hammond's reign of terror over Cold River had gone on long enough. The truth hidden in that stolen deed would finally come to light. He melted back into the shadows to wait for his moment. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote wailed, a sound like lonely weeping. Or perhaps it was laughter at the foolishness of men who thought they could own the water that gave life to all. Through the iron bars of Cold River's jail, lamplight cast long shadows across Mercy's face as she sat on the thin cot. Her clear voice lifted in song, carrying the words of amazing grace into the dusty evening air. Outside, a crowd of townsfolk gathered, their mockery cutting through her hymn. "Singing won't save you now, blind girl," someone called out. Another voice added, "Bet she can't even read the deed she stole." A heavy-set man in a freight man's worn coat shuffled past the jeering crowd. John's heart pounded beneath the disguise as he approached the cell window. His fingers, rough from mountain life, slipped a piece of fresh bread through the bars. "Hold fast," he whispered, barely louder than a breath. Mercy's delicate fingers found his through the iron bars. "Faith doesn't need eyes," she murmured back, squeezing his hand with quiet strength. The touch lasted only seconds before John had to move on, maintaining his disguise. Miles away, Henry White Elk's horse kicked up dust on the trail to Fort Carson. In his saddlebag, carefully wrapped treaties proved the Ute people's ancient rights to Cold River's waters. At the Army post, telegraph keys clicked out an urgent message to U.S. Marshal Reed in Denver. The afternoon stretched endless and heavy. Each hour dragged like a week as hatred simmered in the streets of Cold River. But in her cell, Mercy's voice never wavered as she sang hymn after hymn, her faith a beacon in the growing darkness. Dawn painted Cold River's sky in shades of amber as Sheriff Duke Hammond strutted onto the jail steps. A crowd gathered, their faces dark with anticipation. Hammond held the worn deed high above his head like a trophy. "Good citizens of Cold River," he called out, his voice dripping with false authority. "Today we put an end to this mountain man's scheme to steal our valley's water." The crowd muttered, shifting uneasily in the morning light. Hammond's teeth gleamed as he sneered. John Boone thought he could own it all. Our river, our lives, our future. Well, here's what I think of his plans. He pulled a match from his vest pocket and struck it against the rough wood railing. Dark clouds rolled overhead, and thunder cracked like a whip across the valley. John's voice cut through the crowd. "That deed bears a federal seal." Hoofbeats thundered down the street. Henry White Elk appeared, his weathered face stern as he rode beside a straight-backed man wearing a silver marshal's badge. Behind them, a line of blue-coated soldiers filled the street. "Duke Hammond," U.S. Marshal Clayton Reed's voice rang out clear and strong. "You're under arrest for water rights fraud and falsifying federal documents." As if heaven itself approved, rain began to fall, first in scattered drops, then in sheets that soaked the stunned crowd. The match in Hammond's hand sputtered and died, while the precious deed remained safe in the marshal's grip. Under the church's wooden awning, Marshal Reed unfolded the deed, its federal seal glistening with raindrops. The townspeople huddled close, their faces somber in the gray light. "By order of the United States Land Office," the marshal's voice carried across the crowd, "these water rights are hereby confirmed as the lawful property of the Quinn estate, now passing to Miss Mercy Quinn." Two deputies led Hammond away, chains clinking against his wrists. His shoulders slumped, all pretense of power washed away by the cleansing rain. Mercy stepped forward from the church doorway, her face tilted toward the weeping sky. The rain streamed down her cheeks like tears of joy. John moved quickly to her side, draping his coat around her shoulders with gentle hands. One by one, the townsfolk who had jeered and whispered now approached. Women who had turned away in scorn now dabbed at their eyes with sodden handkerchiefs. Men who had laughed at John's bid in the auction hung their heads in shame. "Miss Quinn," the preacher's wife whispered, her voice trembling, "can you ever forgive us?" Others joined in, their voices a chorus of regret. "We were wrong. We should have helped. Please forgive us." Mercy's face softened with a gentle smile. She raised her hand toward the sound of rushing water from the freed river. "Listen," she said softly. "The river forgives you first. Its waters flow for everyone now." The mountain spring bubbled clear and strong in the late summer sunshine. Where once stood only pine and stone, now a small wooden schoolhouse welcomed both settler and Ute children. Its fresh-cut timber walls gleamed golden in the morning light. Inside, Mercy's fingers danced across raised letters as she taught the children hymns. Her clear voice led them in amazing grace, while small hands, both pale and bronze, followed, the shapes she showed them. In the yard, John guided young boys in measuring lumber, teaching them to build strong and true. The new brass bell, donated by the church elders, rang sweet and clear across the valley. Henry White Elk stood beneath the cottonwoods, cedar smoke rising from his blessing bowl. The sacred smoke drifted across the spring waters, carrying prayers for peace in all four directions. That evening, as sunset painted the cabin windows rose and amber, John's weathered hands opened an official envelope from Denver. His voice grew warm with pride as he read aloud the federal recognition of Mercy's water rights. She listened, her face glowing in the lamplight, then reached for the papers. "Help me sign here," she said softly. "The water belongs to everyone now." John guided her hand as she signed the deed over to a trust for all Cold River's people. The scratching of the pen fell quiet, and in that silence they heard the spring's endless song, a hymn of mercy flowing free, blessing the land and all who dwelled upon it. The sweet-scented winds of another summer evening drifted through Cold River Valley. 5 years had carved gentle lines around John Boone's eyes, marks of joy rather than the old shadows of guilt. He knelt in the mission garden beside Mercy, their hands working together in the rich soil they had nurtured season after season. "The tomatoes are coming in strong this year," John said, guiding Mercy's fingers to feel the firm, round fruits. She smiled, the same radiant expression that had first touched his heart in darker days. "Just like everything else in the valley," she replied. "The Lord provides when hearts flow as free as the water." The mission garden flourished under their care, rows of vegetables, herbs for healing, and flowers that Mercy could identify by scent alone. What had begun as a simple schoolhouse had grown into a place of gathering, learning, and peace. Throughout the day, townspeople came and went along the well-worn path. Martha Stevens brought fresh-baked bread and news of her daughter's engagement. Old Jim Tucker, once Hammond's staunchest supporter, now came weekly to tend the flower beds and seek quiet conversation with John about the burdens of his past. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, more folk gathered by the river. Children played in the shallows while their parents set up benches and spread quilts on the grassy bank. The same preacher who had once turned away from Mercy's suffering now stood in his black coat at the water's edge, waiting as young Sarah Miller brought forward her newborn son. The evening light turned the river to molten gold as the congregation sang. John stood behind Mercy, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. She leaned back against him, feeling the vibration of his voice joining the hymn. The preacher waded knee-deep into the flowing water. "In this river," he proclaimed, "we find God's mercy made manifest. The same waters that quench our thirst and feed our crops now wash this child in grace." As he lowered the baby into the gentle current, the infant's surprised laugh rang out. Smiles spread through the gathered crowd, and soon joyful voices filled the valley. The mission bell pealed clear and true, its bronze voice carrying across land that had once known only discord. John gazed down at his wife, remembering that dusty day in Cold River when jeering faces had surrounded them. "They mocked me for buying you," he said softly, the old pain long transformed into wonder. Mercy turned her face up toward his, placing her hand over his heart, where it had always seemed truest. "But you bought freedom," she replied, her voice rich with conviction. "For all of us." The setting sun painted the scene in amber and rose, glinting off the river that now brought life instead of strife. Children splashed and played where once men had fought over water rights. Ute families and settlers shared food and stories on the banks where suspicion had once ruled. The water flowed on, golden in the evening light, carrying its endless song of grace. Above them, the mission bell rang out once more, its clear tones echoing off the valley walls. No longer a call to judgment, but a celebration of mercy, freely given and received. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.